Support for your public radio station comes from our members and from the Highlands at Pittsford, an independent and assisted living community affiliated with the University of Rochester, offering cottage and apartment homes, daily life enrichment activities, and care assistance as needed. More at highlandsatpittsford.org.
From WXXI News, this is Connections. I'm Evan Dawson. Our connection this hour was made in a billboard at the Syracuse Airport. By now, you've probably seen countless billboards at any airport advertising healthcare systems, bars, cars, just about anything. The billboard in question was rejected. The Syracuse Airport refused to put it up. The billboard advertises a law firm based locally focusing on sexual harassment cases. The lawyer's name is Megan Thomas, and her picture is on the billboard, accompanied by these words: "When HR called it harmless flirting, we called it Exhibit A." That's it. The lawyer's contact information is then listed below. But the airport decided it crossed the line by implying that workplace interactions could rise to the level of sexual harassment. Thomas has said that the airport, after initially agreeing to put the billboard ad up, circled back to tell her they weren't going to put it up unless she softened the language. She said that the airport indicated that the ad would be viewed as threatening or intimidating, especially to male travelers and maybe to local politicians who might find it offensive. The Airport Authority's board recently updated their advertising policy. Here's how Syracuse.com reports the new policy. Quote, "The new policy expands on what is permitted and prohibited in advertisements. It says that advertising must not negatively impact or agitate travelers or tenants, nor disrupt airport operations, and must ensure the airport is a welcoming and attractive space for its diverse travelers," end quote. The attorney, Megan Thomas, was stunned by this. Why would a simple billboard that alerts travelers to her services for potential harassment victims be deemed negative or disruptive? We reached out to the airport, but they declined an invitation to speak or appear on Connections today. In a statement to Syracuse.com, airport management said that the message in Thomas's billboard was unprofessional, inflammatory, and unnecessary. So Thomas is suing. And meanwhile, she's wondering if this is part of the backlash to the MeToo movement, a kind of realigning how we view workplace interactions. And we're glad that she's come all the way in to discuss it. Megan Thomas is an attorney and owner of Megan Thomas Law based in Syracuse. Welcome to the program. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
Lauren Berger is with us, interim executive director of Glow Out. And Lauren's been here in the past talking about a number of issues kind of, I think, related to what we're going to talk about today. It's nice to have you back here. Thanks for being with us.
Well, thanks so much. It's good to be back.
And tell us what Glow Out is.
So Glow Out is, the Glow part is an acronym. It stands for Genesee, Livingston, Orleans, Wyoming. So that's a 4-county, fairly rural, small nonprofit for LGBTQ plus activism, support, and education.
So a lot to talk about here, and I want to first mention that I think, can we post on the YouTube channel? Yeah, so we're posting on our YouTube channel. If you're watching on WXXI News YouTube channel, you can see the billboard. I admit when I first heard about this, I had an expectation that the airport was going to reject the ad because maybe it was like a boss's hand on someone's backside or something like that. You know, it was something like, I don't know. But it's just, Megan, it's just your picture.
Yeah.
And again, I'm going to read the content on there. All it says is, when HR called it harmless flirting, we called it Exhibit A. So I imagine you were surprised that this was banned. Take me through the story.
Sure. So it's funny. I was sharing with Lauren before we went on the air that I actually thought it was a joke. You know, I truly thought that this was not real, because when they told me men might find it intimidating, you know, it's kind of ironic. It's like, this is exactly what I do. I support victims of sexual harassment. I support equality in the workplace. So yeah, I actually thought she was joking, and she was very apologetic. Then when I spoke to her, she's like, listen, you know, when I talked to the higher ups, you know, something that was said is that it could intimidate men. And she was, again, very apologetic. From there, you know, I spoke to one of the higher ups who said essentially, you know, we're really concerned about how local politicians are going to see this, which I said to him, I think local politicians are going to be upset you're not putting it up. And then I said, hey, listen, I've got, you know, 9 other slogans. Take one of them. And he said, okay, I'll take a look. He never responded. To date, he has never responded to any of those. Instead, he patronizingly sent me his own suggestions, which were verbose, not effective, and, you know, just not worth my money, essentially, which I rejected. And so, you know, we went back and forth several times, and ultimately I filed a lawsuit.
Oh man, I'm absolutely curious to know what the airport's suggestions for your billboard were. You can't reveal what they're
Oh,
saying?
I can. Yeah, that's all. That's not part of the lawsuit. So, and it's actually all public online. I did bring them, so I'll share them with. I'll get them out of my bag later.
Okay.
I did bring them, but I'll tell you some of my alternatives, which I think were
Sure.
more edgy.
Sure.
I said things like, we all have 99 problems. A creepy boss shouldn't be one. And that was actually when I toured the airport. That was the slogan that was in my mind. I had this in my head for a long time. Another one I had was harassed at work, #me too, #me too, which I love, which I've since learned someone else did in PA. But I started this firm because I've dealt with these issues. And I remember one time I was, dealing with something and I called around trying to find an attorney to help me. And this guy said, well, you offended them. And I remember being like, what? Like, the law is so protective of victims in New York State. Federal law is also pretty protective, but New York State certainly is. And then I couldn't even find a lawyer to help me when I had, this case. And so I just remember thinking, like, there's a market here. So eventually I started my own firm and, here I am. But that was kind of what was in my head. We all have 99 problems. A creepy boss shouldn't be one. Nobody batted an eyelid when I brought it up the first time. And then suddenly my more, I think, softer version was rejected.
So the funny thing is they're telling you have to soften the language, and you're thinking, I already did.
Correct. Yes.
And when they tell you, or when they told Syracuse.com, and I imagine it's similar to what they told you, they say that it's inappropriate.
That's right.
Unprofessional.
Yep.
And inflammatory. What is inflammatory about the idea that some people's experience at work might be an actual case for harassment? What's inflammatory about that?
I agree. And to be fair, they have said so many different things. In my papers, in my court papers, I say they're ever-changing sand. They just keep changing their mind. Clearly, they're uncomfortable with what I am saying, but they kind of can't decide why. So sometimes it's that it's misleading. Sometimes that it's that it's disparaging. Sometimes that it's too provocative. And so
disparaging to who? Like, I'm still trying. I'm not trying to. I'm not trying to pick a side. I want to talk to the airport. I wish they would have come on today.
I wish they would have too. Yeah, I really do. I think, this is a really important conversation, and it's indicative, as Laura and I were talking about earlier, of some other issues that are happening right now. But, they mentioned that it's disparaging to HR, which I thought was curious. And I pushed back. I said, listen, it's not disparaging to any certain group. Frankly, men and women can be harassed or harassers. But my ad is directed at the idea that harassment is okay, the idea that it's okay to gaslight victims, which I see every day in my practice. I have women call me saying, like, you're the 10th firm I've called. Sometimes you're the 20th firm I've called. No one says they can help me because there's not enough lawyers doing this. And frankly, a lot of people who are doing it are totally overwhelmed with work. So I don't know who it's disparaging to. Frankly, in my true opinion, it's only disparaging if you're engaging in problematic behavior and you're worried about getting caught.
Lauren, what did you make of it when you first heard about this story?
Well, it was pretty surprising because I thought it was a good advertisement. It's effective, it's catchy, it's succinct, and that's what you're going for in advertising pretty much. And yeah, this idea that we're going to respond and say, this is inflammatory and this might cause people to feel offended. It almost seems as though the person who's saying that is telling on themselves a little bit.
I know. I hate to say it because I don't want to get my own lawsuit with the Syracuse Airport. I want to say to everybody involved with the Syracuse Airport in this decision, you're welcome on this program anytime to speak your piece. And I don't know you personally, and I don't make any assumptions about you. I understand why someone's reaction would be, whoa, like, who would have a problem if you find the notion of the existence of sexual harassment threatening? It is, at very least, to me, it requires more discussion. I'm going to put it that way. I'm going to try to say something really anodyne.
Absolutely. And Megan and I were talking before we came upstairs, was if there's an opportunity to have a conversation, then that's an option. Then if there's something where, a part of this language or the way that this ad is laid out is making me uncomfortable and I have some more questions, is very different from we're going to reject this advertisement on the grounds that it's inflammatory. Because at that point, you're sort of obliged to explain, who is defamed or who is offended by those things. Because if we're holding folks accountable for sexual harassment, that ought to be a goal everyone has in a workplace. And so if your response is actually, we want to move away from that, then that's very telling.
Is there a bigger picture in this story to you? I mean, is it about more than just one billboard at one local airport to you?
That's a great question. And I think it's been something that all of us have experienced watching, hashtag MeToo dropped. I think it was 8 years ago now.
Yeah, it's literally 8 years ago, I think, this week.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. So in that time, in a media universe, that feels like several lifetimes. But at the same time, each person has digested all of these cases that happen that are, viral in the media, who are happening between people that we've never met, all the way to discourse around things that do happen in our own lives, because we have each case or each viral moment that everybody sort of reacts to. And that tends to affect people a little bit more is, people like, Brett Kavanaugh, Jeffrey Epstein, a couple of these other like big names. We might not ever be impacted by those individuals, but the ways that people in our lives respond to those individuals is very impactful of survivors and the greater community and the conversation around this. So in those 8 years, there were certainly lots of gains in terms of the consciousness and understanding this issue, but this issue is about power and who has the power. Mm-hmm. And so as you the pendulum starts to kind of swing back and forth, there's the effort to, for those who enjoyed power in the ways of before Me Too and, wanting to bring things back to a kind of status quo or a kind of reassertment of the dominance that they might have once enjoyed, is maybe feeling threatened by the attempt of accountability or by another agency that's trying to rebalance that power.
Yeah, I think there's a lot there that Lauren is talking about, because I think that policy is downstream of culture. And if the policy of an airport, if the policy of a government has changed in the last 5 to 7 years, it's an indication that often that the culture, that there's some sort of a backlash. And it's not a secret that there was some backlash to the Me Too movement. And I also wouldn't put the Me Too movement in one simple sentence, even though people maybe think of it that way. And we're going to get into some of that, listeners, we'd love to know, sort of what you think of this. I mean, I want you to look at this billboard. You got to jump on WXXI News YouTube feed and take a look at this billboard that we're talking about and ask yourself if you think it should have been banned from the Syracuse Airport. Not the Rochester Airport, the Syracuse Airport. Maybe she'll try to put it up in the Rochester Airport.
I've made some calls.
Yeah, have you really?
Yeah, I actually have.
Oh.
Yeah. And I do have their alternative slogans.
Oh, we're going to get to that too.
Yeah.
So listeners, I want to hear from you. I mean, you can react to what you're seeing in the billboard and the rejection. Do you think this is a moment of a backlash to the Me Too movement? Is this an indication that the culture has rejected some of those ideas that rose up 8 years ago? What do you think about the notion of harassment at work? I mean, I already have an email from someone saying, like, is the implication that we're not allowed to flirt at work? So we'll talk about that. But if you want to call the program, it's 844-295-TALK. It's 844-295-8255. 263-WXXI. Call from Rochester, 263-9994. Email the program, connections@WXXI.org. Join the chat on YouTube there. So there is a lot there. But in general, Lauren, do you thinking about the way the policy is downstream from culture, do you think that, not picking winners and losers, but do you think the Me Too movement has seen a pretty significant backlash? Do you think that some of the early ideas that we had talked about on the show years ago have been rejected by the stakeholders, the power holders in our society?
I think probably both yes and no, which it kind of seems like a very hedging answer. But I think that it's about a lot of different implications. Like there's policy implications, there's cultural implications. And at its core, the meta piece is that it's a consciousness. And if we think about Me Too as a reformation of consciousness and a expansion of what we understand in terms of dynamics of power, dynamics of consent, the ways in which those things can come into play and the ways in which power is maintained or wielded against those without it, that kind of ground cannot be ceded. Like we can, have alternative policies that might regress, or we might have a contraction of resources in terms of programs or initiatives with certain types of funding or donations, and that could wax and wane. But the idea of our understanding of sexual violence and the role of survivors cannot be ceded.
Rob's going to hate that I do this, but I do this sometimes because it just comes to me, Rob, right in the middle, and my brain is a little broken lately. So I wonder if we still have the audio clip of President Trump talking about domestic violence and how it affects crime statistics. That was a few weeks ago. We may not have that in the system anymore. If we do, I want to listen to it, just because Joel writes in to say he's reminded of the president last month literally complaining in public that as he looks at the crime statistics, his administration would be doing better if they could just not count when a husband gets in a fight with his wife at home. The implication being that when a man strikes his wife and it counts as a crime stat, the larger picture here is the president, what he's really saying is he sent federal troops into Washington. They're talking about Chicago. They're talking about Portland. And people in news conferences were pointing out crime rate's actually higher in red states. And his rejoinder to that was, yeah, but if you just take out when a husband is fighting with his wife, then we'd be doing a lot better. And, they count that, unfortunately. And Joel is saying this feels like that. This feels like, well, if the perspective of someone is it was a harmless flirtation, but the person who called Megan Thomas's law firm didn't feel like that, that it wasn't a harmless flirtation, that it was a lot more than that it felt like pressure, that it felt like coercion, that it felt like something where your job was on the line. Joel is equating some of these sentiments. Do you feel that way, Megan?
100%. And I feel that way on behalf of my clients who call in every day. They're saying, I have to listen to this behavior. I have to not push back when he's commenting on my legs, or I have to not flinch when he's touching my back. Your job is on the line, and when someone is in a superior position is doing those things to you, you don't feel like you can say no. Similarly with my ad, harmless flirting is not always harmless to the person who's on the receiving end of it. And I've personally been in that position, and it's like, I don't want this, but I don't know how to stand up and say no when you're, the one who's making decisions about my job. So that's really, really challenging.
Okay. And so one of the first emails this hour we had was, is harmless flirting banned in the workplace? What do you say to that?
That's a great question. So the law in New York State is anything more than a trivial inconvenience can amount to sexual harassment in the workplace. So in other words, if the person on the receiving end feels uncomfortable, that matters under New York State law. So, if it's mutual, that's one thing. If it's one person feeling uncomfortable and not returning it, I would really question that, if I was the person engaging that behavior. Furthermore, I probably wouldn't recommend, as an attorney who does this work every day, engaging in that behavior at work, because you never know how the other person truly feels. Or what if, the relationship goes sour and then, something happens later? It's just not a good idea. It really isn't.
To the phones we go. Colleen in Brighton with a question. Hey, Colleen, go ahead.
Yeah, hi, everyone. Glad to hear this topic. It's very interesting and local. I am curious if Megan Thomas had the opportunity to compare her proposed billboard to all of the other billboards that have been on display recently at the Syracuse Airport. And if so, could any of them be seen as possibly offensive by travelers that might see them while using that airport?
Thank you, Colleen. Go ahead, Megan.
Colleen, I'm so glad you asked that question, because that was my first thought. And I quickly foiled every single advertisement that has been at the airport for the last 3 years. And what I found is that, a lot of these ads could be considered disparaging, misleading, provocative. So recently I got my full request, the results back. There's a woman who's naked in a bathtub with her breasts largely exposed. There's other law firms.
Not fully exposed?
Not fully exposed.
But
like I'm fully clothed in my ad. You know what I
yeah,
mean? Like,
yeah,
I don't know.
I get you.
There's advertisements for male enhancement, for breast augmentation. When you walk into the Syracuse Airport, it's like shocking. It's like breast augmentation, Botox, all this stuff is on display the second you walk in. My ad was going to be like in a corner past security. But again, that was concerning to them. There's other law firms too. And listen, these law firms are great. They're people that I really support. But a lot of them are male men on the billboards, and they're allowed to say whatever they want. They told me my ad was misleading, but other ads say we're the best. We're the best litigators, whatever it is. I don't remember exactly what was said, but something about being the best. They said to me, your ad is misleading because it suggests all harmless flirting is actionable, which I disagree with. But furthermore, no one else's ad was put under that extreme spotlight. I think it's a total double standard.
Again, if you're just popping in here, you should probably see the billboard that we're talking about from attorney Megan Thomas, an attorney in Syracuse, the owner of the Megan Thomas Law focused on, I said you focused a lot on these kind of cases. Do you want to just describe your practice briefly?
Sure. So I do focus a lot on sexual harassment in the workplace, but also on discrimination in the workplace on the basis of a protected class, such as sex, gender, religion, etc.
Okay. And the current status is that the Syracuse Airport decided that Megan's billboard for her firm was inappropriate. It was possibly offensive. It was unprofessional. It might upset men in particular, who didn't want to be confronted with the idea that harmless flirting at work could be actionable by law. And so the airport came up with their own suggestions. Instead of your slogan, which was, when HR called it harmless flirting, we called it Exhibit A, the airport decided to have their marketing team was going to help you out.
That's right. Yeah, I needed that.
So what were their suggestions?
Yeah, I appreciate And notably, when I looked at the FOIL request response, I said, was there anything else ever rejected? One other ad was rejected. I never saw any communications about, hey, here are alternative suggestions to your ad. So I thought that was telling as well. Here are their suggestions. When your concerns were brushed aside, we took them seriously. Workplace harassment is real. Let us help you hold them accountable. That's all on one billboard.
That's a lot of words.
Yeah, that's for both. It's not effective advertising. When no one took it seriously, we did. Legal advocacy for those facing sexual harassment and workplace discrimination. Another one, you deserve to be heard. We make sure you are. Standing up for victims of workplace harassment and discrimination. Finally, you spoke up, we listened, and we took action. Legal support for those navigating discrimination or harassment. Again, that doesn't even fit on a billboard. Not only is it not effective, but I would never put all those words on a billboard. No one's going to sit and read that.
Are you trying to be catchy? I mean, I guess that's part of advertising.
Yeah, totally.
Okay. So let me play devil's advocate here.
Sure.
Now. But this implies that all bosses are creepy, and that's not fair.
No, it doesn't. Because where does it even say bosses on my ad? It says when they called it harmless flirting, we called it Exhibit A, because oftentimes, again, my clients are coming in saying, HR told me it wasn't a big deal. And I see this a lot, HR gaslighting. HR said, I don't have a cause of action. Well, I looked at it and I said, yes, you 100% do. Because again, the law in New York State is favorable, helpful to plaintiffs. And that's really important because without that, we don't have an even playing field.
Okay, playing devil's advocate.
Yeah.
You see a claim there because it benefits you as a lawyer. HR is more neutral and they're the better arbiter.
It doesn't benefit me if there's no claim, right? There has to be an actionable claim. I'm incredibly picky with the cases I take because I largely work on contingency, which means I only make money if my clients make money. So I only will take cases if there's something real there.
One other kind of response is, and I read this in a number of places before this program today, in criticism of the MeToo movement. One common critique is that the MeToo movement overemphasized the value and power of accusation and underemphasized the need for evidence. I'm going to ask both of you about that. What do you make of that first, Megan?
I mean, you have to have evidence in order to bring a case. And it's interesting. I hear a lot of comments like this, and I can't bring a case to court without any kind of evidence. I can't even negotiate a case pre-litigation without any evidence. I need that. So the idea that I'm just like throwing out these wild accusations about people and not supporting them is ludicrous. Of course I am. The second a client calls me, I say, what evidence do you have? What evidence exists? If you don't have it, I tell everyone, if you are in a bad situation at work, screenshot everything that could support your case. If you don't have it and you find out later, you want to bring a case, well, what evidence exists? I can get it in discovery, right? But if there's no evidence, I can't really help you.
Okay. What do you make of the concern that is sometimes expressed, usually by men, but not always, that whether it's on a college campus, whether it's in a workplace, that all it takes is one accusation and it can ruin someone's life, usually a man, sometimes a young man?
Yeah, I do hear that a lot too. Again, there has to be evidence to support these accusations or they do go away. And that's the thing. It's like we can't just make these statements, these blanket statements that these men were accused and there was no evidence to support them when they don't know that that's true. Again, as an attorney, as an ethical attorney, I can't bring cases, when there's no evidence. In the court, I'm going to lose if I do that. So I just don't see a lot to support that. If someone's accused, then they should get an attorney too if they feel like they're wrongly accused and, figure it out.
I think maybe extending Lauren's point from earlier, when I think about the airport's response to this, I think the implication, whether they intended this or not, is that as an attorney, you are fishing for possibly harmless comments and looking to amplify them into legally actionable ones so you can go to court.
But why would I do that? Again, it's like my reputation's on the line. And again, I would be thrown out of court laughing. Like they would laugh and throw me out of court. And again, I'm taking cases on contingency. I'm only taking cases that have a ton of evidence. My goal truly is to be the voice of, you have other options to these women, these people, whether it's me or someone else. I frankly don't care. I've got loads of work, but I want people to know, people who are in a situation similar to that I was in earlier points in my career, you have options and the law is on your side.
Lauren, what do you make of the rather consistent complaint that that evidence is not prioritized enough, that accusation trumps evidence in the MeToo era?
I think it's understandable that some people feel that way because of the way in which these types of cases are often disseminated, because it's usually a kind of flurry of virality and discourse when an accusation comes out, particularly of somebody who is high status or well-known or a celebrity. And the pieces of the investigation that happen after that are much quieter for the reasons of, any investigation is often kept very private until those things are ready to be publicized and the case is ready to be made. And at that point, the virality and the discourse is sort of on to the next thing because our attention span collectively, and thinking like social media, can be very, very short. And so there's a lot of energy around, oh, this person was accused. And that's sort of the entirety of the case, and not necessarily understanding that in reality, there's a lot of material that most people are not seeing. And it's similar to when cases of sexual assault happen, in our own community, as opposed to being just like talked about in the abstract, like if they're talking about like a celebrity or a famous athlete, things like that. Because there's often this energy around, well, we should make sure that this is actually true before we, bring charges or harm to this individual. And the reality that we know from data, from statistics, from surveys that are done through crime victim studies all over the country is that the likelihood of somebody going through the process of making a formal complaint, going to HR, is very, very low for things that are genuinely false reports. I think there's a lot of desire for people in society, even if it's somebody that you know and that you care about and you have esteem for, or even, a celebrity who you have a kind of parasocial relationship for, because we do think, oh, they wouldn't do that. That person would never do that. And it's much more comfortable to reject the idea that this person has done harm than the idea that this person might not be who we think they are. And so that energy has been true, before Me Too and still even now. And the other piece is, again, who has the power? And if we think about Me Too in, not exclusively, but it was disseminated in a fairly heterosexual gendered lens that, this is a movement to believe survivors, who are mostly women, to bring accountability to those who have done harm, who are mostly men. But what that didn't capture is that when we talk about survivors and perpetrators, is that those don't discriminate with regard to gender. And so we have a huge resurgence of, but what about the men who are falsely accused? But what about how much they have been harmed, without acknowledging that there are men who are part of the Me Too movement as survivors too. And if we were to look at it as, again, who has the power, how can we support all survivors, then we might be much less ready to jump to the defense and say, well, what about how this thing that somebody said one time has absolutely thoroughly ruined their lives? And then, of course, we see in the reality that that's almost never true.
And briefly, when you talk about sexual violence, and I'm going to include domestic violence, I want to ask you directly. This is what I'm going to use the president's own words. I was alluding to what he said, but this is the actual quote from President Trump 3 weeks ago. He says, they said crime's down 87% in Washington. I said, no. It's more than 87% down. It's virtually nothing now. It's much lesser. But now they take these things that take place in the home and they call them a crime. They'll do anything they can do to find something and call it a crime. If a man has a little fight with the wife, they say this was a crime now. See? So now I can't claim 100% crime is down, but we are. That's the president. What do you make of that?
I think it speaks to this issue of, again, who gets to decide? Who gets to decide what is harassment? Who gets to decide what is harm? Who gets to decide what is a crime and who is deserving of justice and who is deserving of being held accountable? And it's unfortunate that people who have such agency and such power over our society and over our collective understanding of these issues wants to, redirect our attention from something that we have recently understood, recently being in the last several decades, is very real, very harmful, and very destructive to our society, and that rightfully should be considered a crime and persecuted as such. And when we have this sort of jockeying for control, again, to reassert the dominance and to maybe go back to a pre-MeToo era, an era where those things were just a private family matter. And I get that phrase from, it's the title of a book of Victor Rivers. He's a survivor of family violence in, the 60s, 70s, 80s. Both his mother and himself were abused by their father. And when they tried to reach out for help, they were often told, well, that's something you deal with in the home. That's a private family matter. And it's so pervasive and destructive on an individual and a collective level that when we're redefining what is even considered something that society ought to treat as a crime, it speaks to this intense tug of war over, again, who has that power.
Yeah, I can't help but connect this local story to the president's words. I think Lauren is right. The president used the word fight, Megan. He said when a man has a little fight with his wife, now they call it a crime. And he's lamenting that.
Yeah.
In the same way that the airport is lamenting the idea that, you're making people feel like flirtation that might be unwanted is actionable.
Right. I mean, there's a complete lack of empathy here and a complete lack of putting ourselves in other people's shoes. So, to complain, these men, their jobs are being destroyed, their reputations are being destroyed. What about all the women who, for all the time, really, but like in modern history, let's just think about that. But in modern history, who are the victims of these situations? And just let's think about the workplace. In the workplace, how many women have left jobs because they were being harassed on a regular basis and they felt they had no other choice than to leave? I mean, that is really sad. Their careers are being changed, destroyed, what have you, and they had no one for a long time to stand up for them.
Is the price of the pendulum swinging, though, the idea that there might be some overreach and some people might have their lives destroyed with false accusations?
So I think it's true in the social media movement for sure. There can be accusations that aren't supported by evidence. But again, in the legal world, you have to have evidence to move forward. So I'm less sympathetic to it in that world. I do see, in social media, we see all sorts of issues with the lack of evidence.
I think that's a really good distinction. And this is becoming a theme of the week here. Everybody knows how I feel about social media. It's the worst thing that's ever happened anywhere. And I haven't made a secret of that. But I think the distinction from the attorney in the room is really important here. There's a legal standard of evidence, and then there's what social media will do with something. Mm-hmm. And I don't think social media is a good way to adjudicate things. I don't think it's a good way to have conversation, dialogue, hash out difficult issues. It's mostly just a place to amplify a really acute emotion. So I take that point, and I think it's a really, really good one. So when we come back here, I've got a little bit more of your feedback that I want to share with our guests. And then I want to talk about where we go next here. We're going to ask Megan Thomas where this case goes next. Curious to see if this billboard ends up in Rochester's airport. Maybe all airports feel the same way. I don't know. I will not speak for the Rochester airport at all. They're also welcome if they want to come talk about this. But I also want to read a little bit about how companies and organizations are training employees to try to understand harassment and boundaries, and ask both of our guests if they feel like we are going in a better direction with that. So we'll come right back with more of your feedback on Connections.
Support for your public radio station comes from our members and from Mary Cariola Center, proud supporter of Connections with Evan Dawson, believing an informed and engaged community is a connected one. marycariola.org.
This is Connections. I'm Evan Dawson. If you're just joining us, the root of why we're here started with a billboard in the Syracuse Airport, or at least one that was supposed to go in the Syracuse Airport, but the airport decided it was too offensive, it was too inappropriate, it was too unprofessional, and it might offend especially male travelers. It was a billboard from the law firm of attorney Megan Thomas and Megan Thomas Law, a firm in Syracuse that focuses a lot of their work on sexual harassment cases. And all the billboard had was a picture of the attorney, Megan Thomas, who's with us in studio, along with this phrase: when HR called it harmless flirting, we called it Exhibit A. And the airport said, You might be too inflammatory with that. Let's tone down the language. People might find that offensive. Well, one of our listeners says, it does disparage HR people. It implies all HR persons are dismissive of sexual harassment. HR personnel who take their responsibilities seriously could be offended. Megan.
Thanks for that comment. So first of all, for any HR people out there who are taking these things seriously, I so appreciate you, because I have so many clients who are calling me saying, HR told me it wasn't a big deal. HR told me to let it alone. So I see, the other side of that, sadly. But is it disparaging to HR? I don't think so, because I'm not saying all HR is saying X. But it's just an example. When HR called it this, we called it that. And again, that implies that there's additional evidence there. Maybe a text that says, hey, you looked great in that dress today, or hey, want to go grab drinks after work, whatever it is. And again, these things in isolation are one thing, but all together often is when we see a case being built. So I don't think I'm being disparaging to all HR, but I have offered, on multiple occasions, and this offer still stands, I would take out HR and write they. When they called it harmless flirting, we called it Exhibit A. I have no problem with that.
Okay. And I want to make sure I understand your perspective as an attorney who works in this world. For listeners who are kind of tuning in late here, I would sum up your points about the notion of workplace interactions like this. Number one, probably just not a great place to be flirting.
Probably not. Yeah, I wouldn't recommend it.
So that's a good start. But number two, there is a difference between harmless flirting and actionable flirting, and it has to do with a number of things. Sometimes it's power. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it's the repetition and ignoring an indication of someone wanting it to stop. Mm-hmm. It can look a lot of different ways, and different people may perceive it differently. Mm-hmm. But you don't feel like your work includes just taking small interactions and trying to amplify them for legal purposes.
No, because again, I would not make any money on those cases. Like, again, I'm a business person. I run a law firm where I take only the most serious cases, frankly, and help these victims have some kind of result that is better than what they're in, whether they move on with a settlement, whether they go to court, whatever it is. But I would never do that because it's not beneficial to my practice financially, period, in addition to it being unethical, right? I'm not doing that.
How often does it involve someone in a superior position of power actually putting hands on an employee?
A lot of times.
A lot?
Yeah, it's disturbing. And a lot of it's almost everyone who calls my office with a legitimate case has someone in, a position of power harassing someone who's not in a position of power. That person in a position of power doesn't think what they're doing is problematic or doesn't want to think what they're doing is problematic, but they're not being an active listener. They're not paying attention to the reactions of that other person. Or, they simply can't, because they've never been in that person's position, understand what it's like to be in their shoes. Now, something else that I'm a big advocate of, and Lauren, you might have some thoughts on this, are so many women are victims of sexual violence that it's really hard for someone who's not been in that position to understand what it feels like to, again, be placed in that position where you're in a vulnerable place with someone who's more powerful. It's re-victimizing, and a lot of women kind of freeze in that position. So that's something I talk about a lot.
Can you elaborate on that, Lauren?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. A lot of people have already been impacted by sexual violence by the time they enter a professional environment. And so something that, a person who might, again, think that it's a harmless joke, think that it's a harmless flirtation, doesn't realize those implications because there's so much perspective that is unknown to them. Mm-hmm. And that's not necessarily their fault, but it does oblige them to be aware of the potential harm that they could be doing in that environment. And if survivors are in that position, it's very normal to have like the central nervous system response of fight, flight, freeze, fawn. And many people will revert to certain behaviors that are on the surface cooperative out of a needs for survival. And that could be just a physical environment if you feel, physically afraid, physically threatened. But at the same time, we are in, an environment where our healthcare is tied to our employment. And so there's a very real pragmatic need to keep things copacetic in the workplace, lest there be harm, to my income and then therefore my health care. And we think about, people who might have families. And so there's all these existential gravity placed on keeping everything good, in the office. And so if there's somebody who has power over this person and, privilege in their own right, whether that be, by virtue of being male, of being white, of being upper class, any of these things is going to have even more of a kind of an oversight in terms of the ways in which that behavior might affect other people. And, ideally, we would be in an environment where, we could be open about those things. And, anyone in the workplace could take a comment or a joke and say, hey, not really my thing. Really just see as a coworker, want to keep it that way, and sort of move on from there. We're not in that kind of place yet. There's still this sort of the politics of politeness and making sure that everybody, plays nice with one another, and often the dynamics of power in terms of, again, being in a superior role in the office, being the person that signs their paycheck, or just the historical marginalization and dynamics of power that exists between, men who might be in a position of power versus women who are working for them.
That workplace distinction, I think, is probably also important to keep in mind here, because that is a lot of what we're talking about, this dynamic at work. One of our listeners directs me to the case. Listener mentions that last hour I mentioned the YouTube journalist, Andrew Cunningham, who recently interviewed Pete Buttigieg. We played a clip last hour. Someone alerts me to the fact that in 2023, a number of women came forward, and Cunningham apparently put a public apology out and said that he did not realize that his persistence with women around him were viewed in an unwanted way. And the quote from him was along the lines of, I thought my persistence would be seen as flattering. Like, I'm not trying to not take no for an answer. I'm trying to let you know that this is something I think that you and I would both enjoy, and that I want to convince you. And the culture writer, Kat Rosenfield, has essentially said the same thing, not in the workplace context. I think that's what's probably different here. But Rosenfield has argued that we're sort of paralyzing dating, because we're implying that if someone says no the first time, and someone who might be a potential romantic partner says, I really feel like would be a good fit, it's like, legally, are you allowed to keep trying to convince them to go out with you or to sleep with you or whatever? Like, or do you have to take the first no, and if you make another attempt, is it actionable? So I think there's a difference when there's work and there's power that Lauren is talking about. But I mean, I think these are all important questions for us to consider. What would you say to that, Megan?
Yeah, I mean, a great distinction, like whether we're in the workplace or not, really matters. If you're not in the workplace and the context matters, like, are you in an intimate situation and someone's saying no and you keep asking, that's a problem. But if you're, asking someone who said no if you can go on a date with them again, I think that's fine. But you've got to be socially aware enough and emotionally intelligent enough to know when to stop, right? There's many relationships, mine included, that would never have happened if someone wasn't more persistent, right? But again, that wasn't in the workplace, and it was totally respectfully done. And I think, again, just being empathetic, putting yourself in someone else's shoes. How would this make you feel? I remember one time I was at the gym, and it was so uncomfortable for me. This young woman continuously was being hit on by the guy who has worked there. Every time she came in, he'd be like, hey, what about now? Hey, do you want to go out now? It's like this tiny gym, and this guy's hitting on her over and over again. Like, that's not okay. That makes her feel uncomfortable. She's basically trapped in this small space.
But is that legally actionable?
No, I don't think it's legally actionable at that point. No.
Okay, so that's the distinction is, we should have cultural conversations about how to understand what's appropriate.
Yeah.
And then there's legal conversations about where actual lines are.
Right.
Okay. So important distinctions there. Another listener wants to know, I understand that there are exemptions to the statute of limitations for sexual assault, but why do we have a statute of limitations for sexual assault in New York? Are people trying to change those laws? Is that accurate? Statute of limitations on sexual assault?
So there is a statute of limitations on sexual assault. I deal with workplace, so I know those kind of off the top of my head. But essentially, there was the Victim Survivors Act, probably what this person is referring to, where we put a pause on all statute of limitations. We said everyone who ever had a claim can bring it. That has now ended, and so essentially, there's statute of limitations on issues. And that is an unfortunate reality for a lot of people who call me, and it's too late. That's a problem. But at the same time, thinking about from the other side of the table, people need to understand that there's a limitation to when, things can happen. So I think it's complicated. Do I wish the statute of limitations was longer? Of course, but I'm a plaintiff's lawyer.
Okay.
I think that those distinctions go back to what you were talking about where, within a workplace where there's like established and arbitrary benchmarks of is something particularly egregious, is something persisted, those type of ways in which we can catalog whether or not something is escalatory or offensive. But culturally, it's much more muddy. And so when we think about, laws around sexual assault, sexual harassment, sexual violence, it's, I think, important to remember that those are born from a need to, operate from a written word for a judicial system. And in many ways, that system is older than what we understand about the ways in which someone can be harmed. Most of the laws were written, for like, Megan has a sheep, I steal Megan's sheep. We get the sheep back and I pay reparations, and there's sort of like property exchange that's rendered healed in that way. But when someone is harmed in a way that is of a sexual violent nature, there's something qualitatively that has been taken, but that we can't necessarily quantify. And so we're trying to do this in a written system of laws that is entirely too old and in some ways not designed to actually capture what justice for that person might look like. And so it's this kind of parallel conversation where we have the justice system and kind of remittance of any kind of reparations or justice or healing. And then we have that cultural side where it's more about how do we communicate with each other? How do we, engage in flirting coming out of a culture where we were taught, women are supposed to say no because that's, makes you look more pure and chaste, even if you do actually want the person. We tell boys, never, like, don't take no for an answer. Make sure that you, pursue and dominate, and like all of these really harmful norms that people are sort of trying to evolve from. And none of us have done this before. So it's all of our first time on earth. And so the ability to be authentic and honest about that is the path forward, although it's a little clunky to say to somebody, okay, so when you rejected me, did you mean that? Do you want me to stop? Or did you want to maybe think about it and give me another chance? Like, it feels weird to say those things, but it might be the only way forward.
Important distinctions here. We got a lot to try to squeeze in the last few minutes. Jane says, great discussion today. A reminder for people regarding HR. HR is there to protect the company, particularly from litigation, not the employee. Do you agree with that?
100%. I say that every day of my life. Like, I'm always telling clients, HR doesn't protect you. You cannot trust HR. These HR investigations, they are buying them time, and they will find against you, so many percentage
I'm just going to tell you, I think our HR here does a great job.
I'm sure you have a good one, but obviously I'm not getting calls where the good ones are involved, right? I only get calls where HR is not doing a good job. Do I hate HR? No, of course not. Like, there's plenty of people, I have friends in HR, and I think a lot of people do a great job. But a lot of times, it's true, HR is there to protect the company. Just like I tell my clients, just like I'm there to protect you and not the other side, they're there to protect the company. That's their job.
All right, quick one from Michelle. Question for Megan. How often do you find the potential clients come to you and you eventually have to tell them that it turns out they do not have a case?
That's a good question. I would say, not very frequently, because by the time someone works up the gumption to call me, they usually do have a case. And in fact, so many of my conversations start out by people saying, I probably don't have a case, but, and I'm like, oh my God, you've got 4 causes of action and this is egregious and all this stuff. So that doesn't happen that much.
All right. Lastly, the Harvard Business Review took a look at surveys of men and women in the post-MeToo workplace world and examined how much the movement was affecting workplaces. And their conclusion is not a whole lot's changed for the better in the last decade. And here's why. In response to MeToo, companies have required more mandatory sexual harassment training, often in the form of videos and seminars. Mostly, the Harvard Business Review found, they don't work. And this is their conclusion. Researchers have several recommendations for organizations looking to reduce harassment, a number of which involve prevention training. Their study shows that traditional sexual harassment training has little effect, perhaps because much of it focuses on helping employees understand what constitutes harassment, and the data shows they actually already do. Instead, the researchers say companies should implement training that educates employees about sexism and character. Their data shows that employees who display high levels of sexism are more likely to engage in negative behaviors, and they believe training can reduce those levels. Their data also shows that people of high character, those who display virtues such as courage, are less likely to harass and more likely to intervene when others do. Though character building in organizations is on the cutting edge and consultants are just learning how to do this, there are training resources available. Our researchers right, end quote. What do you think of that, Megan?
I would add that empathy training is really important. When you can put yourself in someone else's shoes, you can have a better understanding of, would this make me feel uncomfortable or not? I think in New York State, the training is actually better than in a lot of other places in the country. There's some really good guidelines in New York State. And I have had a lot of people say firsthand to me, I didn't even know this was actionable until I went through this training. So I actually think it's been helpful. I don't have statistics on it in New York State, but I'm a big believer in it. But I do think that, and let's work on character building, let's work on empathy training, et cetera, awareness building would be more helpful.
About a minute. What do you make of that?
I think that having training is never a bad thing. I think that most companies might have a further benefit if they took it one step farther and dealt with kind of the practical application of, rather than the statewide video training, which is valuable. Beyond that, what does this look like in this restaurant, in this law firm, in this auto shop, in every specific place of navigating that with each other? Because at the end of the day, it's about these conversations and the ways that we interact with each other and the ways in which we can try to understand these things before we have to call Megan. And, if HR is a part of those conversations, I know people in HR do wonderful work. It's often very difficult and very thankless, but they have a key role to play in that too, because the more that this is normalized and equalized and people can have authentic conversations, the more we actually can, prevent some of these things before it's an actionable item.
All right, last 30 seconds. What sparked this whole conversation was a billboard that the Syracuse Airport rejected from your law firm, Megan. So what happens next?
So I filed a motion for a preliminary injunction, which essentially means it'll get before the judge sooner. And we have submitted all of our papers on that. So we're waiting for a response from the judge. So I'm really holding my, breath here, crossing my fingers, all of it, hoping that my billboard will be placed up. I
actually think this is going to end up being good for you. We're having a bigger conversation because of it, but I know it's not what you wanted.
That's right. Right.
And I will say, the airport is absolutely welcome to come on here. I would love to talk to them about why they made that decision and some of the parameters of their advertising policy. So maybe they will, probably not, but it's an open door. In the meantime, let us know if the Rochester Airport takes your building.
All right, I'll let you know.
Will you let us know?
For sure, I'll let you know.
Thank you for being here. Where can people learn more about your work?
You can go onto my website, mkt-law.com. You can follow me on LinkedIn, and I look forward to it. Thank you,
appreciate your time.
Thank you, Lauren.
And Lauren is the interim executive director of Glow Out. Maybe we'll talk on a separate occasion about some of the work you're doing there.
I'd love to do that.
Come back anytime. I really appreciate your expertise here.
Well, thanks so much.
And listeners, thank you for a provocative hour. A lot of really good and important conversations and emails there. Got as many as we can. We are going to be back with you tomorrow for Friday on Member-Supported Public Media.
This program is a production of WXXI Public Radio. The views expressed do not necessarily represent those of this station, its staff, management, or underwriters. The broadcast is meant for the private use of our audience. Any rebroadcast or use in another medium without expressed written consent of WXXI is strictly prohibited. Connections with Evan Dawson is available as a podcast. Just click on the Connections link at WXXInews.org.